April 12, 1944, Rabaul, New Britain. The temperature was 93 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air was so thick with humidity it clung to every inch of exposed skin. The jungle didn't hum, it suffocated. Leaves hung heavy with moisture, and even the insects seemed to move slower. But in the center of the Japanese command post, just outside the Warren airfield, the mood was light. Laughter echoed through the wooden hut, bouncing off the walls and disappearing into the hot Pacific air. Captain Takashima stood in the shade, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth as he watched the Americans across the ridge unloading cargo. His uniform, crisp just weeks before, was now permanently stained with salt and soil. But it wasn't the heat that caught his attention. It was the absurdity of what he saw. A long line of American servicemen moved boxes from the bellies of freshly landed C-47s. Ammunition, radios, tools. Then came the smaller containers, white, insulated, and carefully marked with bold letters that read frozen dairy, U.S. Army, milk, ice cream, milkshakes. The captain chuckled softly at first, then turned to his staff officer with a smirk, barely hidden behind a thin veil of sweat. "They've brought dessert to the front line." The others laughed harder. One leaned in and added, "Maybe they'll invite us to a picnic next." That laugh carried weight. It wasn't just about the milkshakes. It was about everything they believed about the Americans. Soft, indulgent, dependent on luxuries. While Japanese troops marched barefoot through leech-infested mud, eating rice balls wrapped in banana leaves, their enemies were sipping vanilla shakes with chocolate drizzle. It was both pathetic and comical to them. At that moment, Captain Takashima believed he was looking at a military that had never truly suffered. A generation raised on sugar and Hollywood, trying to fight a war in the jungle now with desserts. He didn't know, couldn't have known, that what he was witnessing was not a weakness. It was a warning. That milkshake did not arrive by accident. It had crossed an ocean. It had passed through factories, rail hubs, naval convoys, and freezing units. It was part of a chain so vast, so meticulously engineered that it could deliver a frozen drink to the edge of a tropical war zone without missing a beat. It represented more than comfort. It represented a machine, a system, a will. But none of that was visible under the blinding sun that day. To the Japanese, the jungle was a crucible, one that would break the Americans before the bullets ever did. They had been hardened through decades of war in China and Southeast Asia. Every leaf of the forest felt familiar, every hardship a badge of honor. Their belief in the power of sacrifice was absolute. Suffering was not a side effect of war, it was the essence of it. So when they saw milkshakes, they saw surrender. Yet behind every laugh there was a blindness, a failure to see what modern war was becoming. Not a test of pain endurance, but a contest of momentum. Not just courage, but supply. Not just bullets, but calories. The milkshake was a message, and they missed it. It wasn't the only thing they missed. They didn't see the portable refrigeration units quietly humming in the back of American trucks. They didn't see the efficiency of inventory management or the modular field kitchens designed to serve hundreds of troops per hour. They didn't know that each of those boxes was part of a doctrine, a philosophy of war that said morale wasn't a luxury. It was a weapon. Back in Tokyo, the high command remained confident. American indulgence was treated as a weakness in strategy briefings. Propaganda films mocked the softness of enemy troops. Even on the front lines, Japanese soldiers whispered jokes about the Americans needing cake and cream to hold their rifles. But under that confidence, something else had started to creep in. A strange, unsettling question. If they were really so weak, why hadn't they broken yet? There were reports. Pockets of resistance that refused to fold. Marine units that fought for days without resupply, yet somehow still stood their ground. Aircraft sorties that continued through storms and fuel shortages. It was like trying to suffocate a beast that never stopped breathing. And still, they laughed. They laughed when the first sea rations were discovered full of gum and powdered lemonade. They laughed when prisoners described warm meals and chocolate bars. They laughed when an intercepted radio transmission included a request for more strawberry mix. They kept laughing, until the day the rations held longer than their own, until the day their stomachs turned hollow, and the jungle started to consume them instead. War, they believed, was about the spirit, but the Americans had rewritten the rules. They had industrialized morale, they had weaponized nutrition, and the milkshake was just the beginning. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever heard this side of the war? If this changed the way you see World War II, consider subscribing for more stories like this, hidden beneath the surface of the battlefield. It started with laughter, but it was built on belief. Inside the minds of Japanese officers, the American soldier was more than just an enemy. He was a caricature, spoiled by excess, dependent on convenience, the very opposite of what it meant to be a warrior. Where the Imperial Army saw nobility in discomfort, the Americans seemed to carry their comforts into the battlefield like children bringing toys to school. Milkshakes, chewing gum, canned fruit, music, letters scented with perfume. It was easy to mock, easy to underestimate. In Tokyo, military planners described the United States not just as a nation of factories, but of softness, a culture where luxury blurred the line between need and want, where soldiers were sent to war with candy in their pockets and peanut butter in their packs. Japanese newspapers published cartoons mocking GIs as fat, lazy, and always asking for seconds. Propaganda films painted them as fragile men shielded by machines and pampered by overproduction. What they missed was that those machines didn't just shield them, they shaped them. On the islands where blood soaked the soil, American troops arrived with things the Japanese could barely believe. Portable shower units, typewriters for correspondence, field radios playing jazz late into the night. They brought a piece of home to the battlefield. But to the Japanese, this wasn't resilience. It was delusion. War was meant to strip men down to the bone, to grind away the comfort until only the soul remained. So when they saw soldiers smiling while drinking cold coffee or eating mashed potatoes from a can, it triggered something deeper, contempt. Because to them, war wasn't about winning. It was about proving endurance, proving resolve, proving that the samurai spirit still lived in the mud and blood of the Pacific. There was even a name for it, gammon, the Japanese concept of silent suffering, of bearing the unbearable. Troops were trained not just in combat but in the art of deprivation. They were taught that pain was honorable, that hunger was a form of loyalty, that sleep was a luxury for the weak. So when American soldiers arrived with boxes of powdered milk and portable refrigeration units, it didn't just look absurd. It looked offensive. It felt like cheating. But behind that offense was fear. Because somewhere beneath the ridicule, they knew that comfort was only possible if the system could deliver it. And the system behind those milkshakes was something they had never encountered before. The American war machine did not operate on sacrifice. It operated on abundance. It was not built for survival. It was built for dominance. And it was patient, methodical, relentless. Yet in 1944, most Japanese officers still believed the enemy would break under pressure, that no amount of chocolate or canned soup could prepare a man for jungle rot, for monsoon rains, for nights filled with swarms of mosquitoes and the screams of the wounded. But the breaking point never came. Marine units dug in and held their ground for weeks. Infantry divisions fought through tropical storms without faltering. Bombing raids continued like clockwork, even as pilots braved flak and exhaustion. And what disturbed Japanese commanders the most was that the enemy didn't seem to suffer. They didn't march barefoot. They didn't starve. They didn't crack. One Japanese officer wrote in his personal log, later found in a cave on Saipan, "They are still singing. They eat warm food. They laugh even as we shell them. Why do they not tire? Why do they not vanish?" The answer was never about morale. It was about infrastructure. American soldiers could laugh because someone had built the conditions for them to laugh. They could eat warm food because entire divisions of logistics specialists made sure they could. It wasn't weakness. It was design. Still, the Japanese clung to their worldview. Even in the face of defeat, they believed the Americans were spiritually empty, that no machine, no milkshake, no matter how cold, could replace the fire of a warrior's soul. But that fire couldn't boil water without fuel. And while Japanese soldiers lived on bowls of rice and dried fish, the Americans were consuming 4,000 calories a day, fortified with vitamins, protein, and sugar. Every chocolate bar was a brick in the foundation of something far more terrifying than they realized. Because the Americans were not there to fight like the Japanese. They were there to overwhelm them. And yet the arrogance persisted. Even as bases fell and battles were lost, the myth of American fragility endured. In part because the truth was too bitter to swallow. the reality that luxury had become strategy, that comfort had become advantage, that what they saw as decadence was actually doctrine. Every milkshake, every ration pack, every song playing from a dusty radio. It was not a distraction from the war. It was a part of the war. And the moment they stopped laughing, it was already too late. Tell us in the comments, had you ever imagined that milkshakes could become a symbol of victory? If this gave you a new angle on history, tap the subscribe button and help us share these untold perspectives with the world. To the untrained eye, the milkshake was just a luxury, a laughable indulgence in a place that demanded grit and discipline. But to those who understood the mechanics behind the war, it was something else entirely. It was a message written in sugar and steel. It was the end point of a process that stretched across thousands of miles, hundreds of machines, and tens of thousands of people, all synchronized to deliver one thing to one man in one jungle at exactly the right time. That milkshake had more moving parts than some fighter planes. It began on dairy farms scattered across Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Farmers woke before the sun, milking cows by the thousands. The raw milk was transported in insulated tankers to regional processing plants, where it was filtered, pasteurized, and condensed. Then it was dried into powder form using massive spray-drying towers, reducing gallons of liquid into something that could fit into a sealed tin the size of a soup can. Those cans were packed by the millions. From there, they entered a supply network that most countries couldn't even imagine. The tins were loaded onto trains, thousands of them, and sent to coastal depots. In California, ships waited in harbors, refrigerated holds ready. The milkshake mix was stacked beside cans of peaches, boxes of chocolate, ammunition, socks, and morphine. Every ship was a floating artery in a body that never slept. On the deck, crews checked manifests down to the last crate. In the engine room, mechanics kept the cooling units running. Below deck, beneath the roar of the diesel engines, American efficiency moved in silence. And this was just the beginning. Once the cargo reached the Pacific, it was unloaded not into cities, but into improvised ports carved into beaches. Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, worked day and night to build roads, landing strips, and walkways under fire. Within days of an island being secured, it had a working refrigeration point. From there, the milkshake would be sent to forward supply units. Trucks outfitted with ice generators and freezer compartments delivered it closer to the front line. In some cases, units used small gasoline-powered ice cream machines to mix the powder and water, churning a cold drink in conditions where soldiers had barely enough to drink. It sounds impossible, but it happened, over and over. In Okinawa, soldiers drank cold milkshakes, just hours after securing a shell-torn hill. In New Guinea, engineers celebrated the opening of a new airstrip with root beer floats made from rationed syrup and army ice cream mix. These were not accidents. They were expressions of a doctrine. The American war machine understood something few others did. A soldier with high morale could fight longer, move faster, and break slower. Calories were fuel. Comfort was endurance. A milkshake was not a dessert. It was a tool. Each serving carried between 500 and 700 calories, loaded with sugar, fat, and carbohydrates. It could replace an entire meal in a pinch. It could keep a man standing after 16 hours in a trench. It could bring back the color in a face turned pale from exhaustion. And the psychological effect was just as powerful. A sip of something cold, sweet, and familiar could ground a man in the middle of chaos. It reminded him that someone, somewhere, cared whether he came back, that he wasn't just a body in a uniform. He was part of a system that saw him, fed him, respected his suffering. This was not a random gesture of kindness. It was logistics as warfare. Behind every sip was an invisible army. Quartermasters tracking demand, engineers maintaining refrigeration units in 100-degree heat, supply officers calculating sugar allotments down to the gram, bureaucrats pushing requisitions through a labyrinth of paperwork so that the powder would arrive not weeks late, but exactly on time. No other nation on Earth had this capability. The Japanese certainly didn't. Their supply system was built for simplicity. Rice, pickled vegetables, dry fish. Light, portable, and rooted in the idea that a soldier should not expect comfort. If he survived, it was because he was meant to. The army provided only what was necessary, and even that often failed to arrive. In contrast, the Americans sent what was desirable. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about winning. Winning the body. Winning the mind. The milkshake, in all its creamy absurdity, revealed the real difference between the two sides. One was trying to endure the war. The other was engineering how to outlast it. Every detail had purpose. Even the size of the cans, designed to fit perfectly into crates stacked in multiples of 12. Even the flavor variety, because offering chocolate and strawberry options gave men the illusion of choice, and that illusion strengthened morale. This level of planning was not accidental. It was industrial doctrine in action. And here lies one of the greatest ironies of the war. What the Japanese saw as decadence was actually precision. What they mocked as weakness was resilience, built layer by layer, crate by crate, calorie by calorie. Because in the jungles of the Pacific, bullets mattered, bravery mattered, but so did blood sugar. And that milkshake, cold, sweet, and heavy in a tin cup, carried more strategic weight than most of the rifles on the island. Let us know in the comments, did you ever imagine something so simple could carry such complex power? If this perspective moved you, tap that subscribe button and become part of a community that sees history from the inside out. It happened near Biak Island, June 1944. The jungle heat was suffocating and the rain came in bursts that turned the soil into thick, clinging mud. Japanese forces had pushed deep into the interior, believing they had cornered a group of American soldiers on a ridge known only by its code name, Hill 409. The plan was simple: starve them out, cut off their supply lines, wait out the heat, and strike when exhaustion made resistance impossible. But the Americans didn't break. Not in 2 days, not in 5. By the 7th day, something felt wrong. From the Japanese position, scouts reported seeing movement on the hill. Not frantic or desperate, but calm, disciplined. Fires were lit. Cooking smoke rose. There was laughter, actual laughter, echoing through the dense canopy. Inside a captured Japanese command diary recovered weeks later, a chilling sentence was written by an officer who had witnessed it firsthand. They are still cooking, still talking. They are not starving. Why? The answer came when the hill was finally retaken, not by force, but by attrition. After a final push, Japanese forces reached the top only to find empty trenches, discarded ration boxes, and a single generator left humming under a tarp. Scattered among the rubble were tin cans labeled frozen dairy mix. Alongside them, empty wrappers from chocolate bars, remnants of biscuits, a few coffee filters, and 2 small mechanical stirrers. The Americans hadn't been abandoned. They had pulled back after holding the line for nearly 9 days. Surrounded, outnumbered, and yet somehow nourished, functioning. This wasn't just survival, it was a warning. In the jungle, food is everything. It is energy. It is morale. It is hope. The Japanese had learned to live with little, but living is not the same as enduring. American forces, cut off and isolated, had managed to hold their ground not just through firepower, but through a steady intake of calories, hydration, and warmth. That milkshake, the one Japanese officers had laughed at months earlier, was part of the reason. The powdered dairy mix that had seemed so ridiculous was engineered for conditions exactly like this. It required only water and movement, mixed by hand or machine. It could be consumed cold or lukewarm. It restored electrolytes, delivered fats and sugar, and most importantly, lifted spirits. It wasn't just about nutrition, it was psychological combat. In one recovered American letter, a soldier wrote to his wife, "We're still holding. We had shakes yesterday. Tasted like cardboard, but it reminded me of home. I needed that." That single line says more about the war than 1,000 battle reports. In the middle of isolation, with the enemy tightening their grip, what kept him grounded was not just the mission, it was a moment of normalcy, the texture of something familiar in a world turned upside down. And for the Japanese, this was unnerving. Because for all their discipline, for all their spiritual preparation, they were running out of fuel. Not metaphorically, literally. As the war dragged on, Japanese supply lines crumbled. Convoys were sunk. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Rice rations were cut. Troops were ordered to forage. Some began to suffer from beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin B deficiency, leading to fatigue, weakness, and eventual organ failure. The jungle was no longer a proving ground. It had become a graveyard. American forces, meanwhile, had created an invisible armor around their troops. Logistics had become defense. Food had become resilience. There's a detail often overlooked in war histories: the presence of Quartermaster Corps combat liaison officers embedded within infantry units. Their job was not to shoot, but to ensure the line of nourishment was never broken. Even during combat, they coordinated with engineers and medics to make sure the soldiers were eating, drinking, staying warm. These were the ghost soldiers of World War II. You never saw them in the movies, but they were everywhere, behind the front line, keeping the fight alive. And the milkshake was their quiet symbol, a signal that the system was working. One captured Japanese soldier, interviewed after the war, confessed to being confused by what he saw in American trenches. He described strange machines, cans of orange juice concentrate, even tubes of something sweet squeezed directly into the mouth. His voice trembled when he said, "We were hungry. They were making ice." That sentence cuts deep, not because of what it says about food, but what it says about belief. The Japanese had believed hunger was strength, that pain made them pure, that suffering gave them honor. But honor does not build muscle. Pride does not hydrate tissue. Glory does not stop your hands from shaking when your blood sugar crashes. The Americans didn't reject suffering. They just didn't see it as a strategy. They built around it. They planned for it. They drowned it in sugar, sealed it in tins, and dropped it from planes. They didn't win the war by fighting harder. They won by outlasting, outfeeding, outthinking. So when the Japanese reached Hill 409 and found not broken men but empty wrappers and humming machines, it marked more than the end of a battle. It marked the collapse of an illusion, the illusion that the enemy could be broken by starvation and silence. Instead, they had met an army that drank milkshakes in the middle of hell and kept going. If stories like this make you feel closer to the human side of war, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring these forgotten corners of history, you're always welcome to subscribe. This journey is just getting started. They laughed at the milkshake, but they never saw the machine that delivered it. Not the truck convoys, not the rail lines, not the men with clipboards at the Brooklyn Navy Yard checking every crate down to the gram. They didn't see the factory in Chicago that produced condensed milk 24 hours a day, or the naval refrigeration ships that crisscrossed the Pacific like floating freezers, humming with silent power beneath their armored decks. Because in war, power does not always roar. Sometimes it hums. Every sip of that creamy, sweet liquid came from an unbroken chain of calculation and effort that began months earlier, half a world away. It started with a farmhand waking before sunrise in rural Iowa, milking cows by hand or machine. That milk was funneled into tankers, transported to plants where it was pasteurized, homogenized, and converted into long shelf-life powder. From there, it passed through a gauntlet of logistics: military requisitions, inspection stamps, sealed crates, transportation manifests. The milkshake was not a drink. It was the tip of a spear made of spreadsheets and blueprints. When that crate arrived on the front line, it brought with it the weight of a nation operating at full capacity, the unseen fingers of engineers, planners, and civilians whose daily labor fueled the soldiers' strength. It brought with it the ghosts of silent shifts in factories where women worked through the night, welding and packing, sealing cans and taping boxes. The Japanese never feared that spear. They only saw the tip. They saw soldiers sipping milkshakes and assumed softness. They saw abundance and mistook it for decadence. They didn't grasp the terrifying truth that behind that single serving of dairy powder stood an industrial structure so vast, so well coordinated, that it could deliver ice cream to the edge of a battlefield, and bullets at the same time. It was a myth-breaking realization, one that hit slowly and unevenly. First came the shock that the Americans could set up kitchens within days of landing. Then the recognition that their mess hall served hot meals while under enemy fire. And finally, the unsettling fact that American troops were eating better in war than many Japanese civilians were at home. In late 1944, a Japanese reconnaissance patrol infiltrated a recently abandoned American encampment near Leyte. They found no bodies, no prisoners, but they did find something that made them stop in silence: a refrigeration truck, still running. Inside, trays of eggs, sealed tins of butter, and stacked metal cans marked chocolate beverage compound. It wasn't just milkshakes. It was a culinary presence, a traveling version of the homeland that followed its soldiers wherever they went. The Americans did not abandon comfort in war. They brought it with them, armed it, and used it as a weapon. For the Japanese, This bordered on madness. War was supposed to strip men down, not build them up. It was supposed to make you feel smaller, not remind you of home. But that was the difference. American doctrine saw morale as a strategic asset. To fight longer, your muscles needed glycogen, your thoughts needed clarity, your will needed reinforcement. And while bravery and honor could push a man through a firefight, it was nutrition and care that brought him back for the next one. This is why entire American divisions had personnel whose only job was to move food. Not generals, not gunners. Movers, mechanics, inspectors, quartermasters. Every single crate in the Pacific passed through a labyrinth of handlers who ensured it was accounted for, stored correctly, and delivered on schedule. This was not improvisation. It was orchestration. Even the flavors were chosen with precision. Chocolate was preferred in high-heat environments due to better shelf stability. Vanilla provided glucose spikes that helped recovery after exertion. Strawberry, though rare, was used in morale packs for its emotional value, a taste associated with summer and childhood. And yet, behind every flavor there was steel, refrigerated rail cars, reinforced shipping containers, bulletproof paperwork. Nothing reached the front line by accident. If a soldier drank a cold milkshake in a jungle, it meant 6,000 people had done their job exactly right. That is not luxury. That is mastery. This is what the Japanese failed to understand. The milkshake was never about indulgence. It was about proof. Proof that America could outthink the climate, outsupply the terrain, outendure the jungle. It was the sound of generators in the night, the hiss of pressure valves, the click of organized labor defeating chaos. Because in modern war, death comes in two forms, sudden and violent or slow and logistical. The Americans had found a way to silence the second. When a GI sat down and poured a scoop of powder into his tin cup, he wasn't just refueling. He was taking part in a system so complex it could only exist in a country that had turned its entire economy into a machine for survival. That single scoop might have passed through 50 hands before it reached him. And still, the Japanese never saw it coming. They saw the smile on the soldier's face but missed the factories behind his grin. They heard the clink of the metal spoon, but missed the engine that kept the mix cold. They tasted defeat without ever understanding what they were up against. Let your voice be heard in the comments. Did you ever realize something as simple as a milkshake could be this powerful? If you're fascinated by the unseen forces that shape history, now's the time to subscribe and explore this journey with us. Your curiosity helps keep these forgotten truths alive. By the start of 1945, something had shifted in the rhythm of the war. It wasn't visible from a bomber's cockpit or audible from a battleship's deck. It could only be felt on the ground, in the way American units moved, the way they recovered, the way they endured. It began with small things. A medic noting fewer cases of fatigue-induced collapse. A lieutenant surprised by how long his men could stay on patrol. A company that, even after 48 hours in the jungle, still marched in formation with steady steps. Doctors and officers started connecting the dots. The rations were working. But more than that, the comfort was working. American soldiers weren't just surviving. They were outperforming expectations in conditions designed to break them. And among the many reasons behind this endurance, one of them stood out for how absurd it sounded on paper: the milkshake. Inside the high command, reports began to circulate. Units with access to morale-enhancing rations, including powdered dairy drinks and chocolate-based supplements, were showing better resilience under pressure. That single item, once dismissed as a luxury, was now seen as a multiplier, not just nutritionally but psychologically. A soldier stationed in the Philippines wrote in a letter, "We haven't had clean clothes in 5 days, haven't slept more than 4 hours a night, but yesterday they rolled up with a cooler, chocolate shakes." It felt like seeing a piece of heaven through the jungle. That moment of peace, that anchor to something outside of mud and mosquitoes, kept his spirit upright. The milkshake was no longer a reward. It was an intervention. The Japanese, by contrast, were starving. By early 1945, their supply lines had deteriorated beyond repair. American submarines had severed the arteries that once fed their island outposts. Convoys were gone. Merchant fleets were shattered. Rations were halved, then halved again. Troops began boiling leaves, catching rats, mixing sawdust with rice. Diseases like beriberi and dysentery surged. Energy levels collapsed. A battalion that had once marched 20 kilometers in a day could barely manage 5. Men passed out while digging trenches. Some died in their sleep. There were no milkshakes, no chocolate, no refrigeration. And in that difference, in the gap between fatigue and vitality, between endurance and collapse, lay the outcome of battles before a shot was ever fired. In Peleliu, American engineers were constructing a forward kitchen just weeks after securing the beach. The front line was only 2 miles away. The island was still being shelled. Yet by the end of the week, troops were eating hot food again. Milkshake powder was being stirred into steel cups with filtered water, cooled in portable ice containers made from scrap engine parts and raw ingenuity. The effect was immediate. Officers reported higher morale, lower anxiety, faster recovery from exhaustion. Soldiers began looking forward to meals as moments of restoration, not just physically, emotionally. A milkshake might not close a wound, but it could pull a man back from the edge of mental collapse. This wasn't theory. It was battlefield tested. On Okinawa, during one of the bloodiest and most relentless campaigns of the Pacific, American soldiers dug in under constant rain and artillery fire. For weeks, they lived like ghosts, wet, cold, underfed, and sleep-deprived. The terrain gave them nothing. The enemy gave them less. But then the trucks came. Rolling across narrow roads carved into the mud, the logistics teams brought not just ammunition and fuel, but pallets of powdered drink mixes, canned fruit, and dry ice units. It didn't change the battlefield. It changed the men on it. The Japanese forces across the line watched the same trucks with a mix of disbelief and dread. Through binoculars, they saw soldiers drinking from mugs, eating warm food, handing out dessert packs with laughter still in their throats. And that laughter was terrifying, because it meant they had enough left inside to laugh, enough energy to share, enough morale to still feel human. On the Japanese side, the mood was silent. Exhaustion had become identity. Food was a memory. Sleep, a gift. A report from a captured officer read simply, "We eat once a day. Our bodies are thin, but their bodies grow. We shoot, but they still smile." That smile wasn't arrogance. It was system support. The Americans had transformed morale into a function of supply. Their soldiers weren't just being fed. They were being sustained. Strategically, consistently, predictably. And the milkshake, once mocked, became a symbol of that precision. Not every soldier got one, but every soldier knew it existed. That somewhere nearby, someone was planning not just his fight, but his survival. That he was seen not only as a weapon, but as a person. This is what frightened the Japanese command more than tanks or planes. They had no way to match it. No trucks to deliver sugar. No infrastructure to chill drinks. No factories still standing to send powdered happiness halfway across the ocean. They were watching not just the superiority of machines, but the superiority of intention. The Americans weren't improvising morale. They were manufacturing it. And in a war that turned every man into a cog in a vast and grinding engine, that intention, that ability to make soldiers feel cared for, became the engine's most powerful fuel. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story surprised you the most? If this kind of human detail makes history feel real for you, hit subscribe and keep walking with us through the forgotten corners of World War II. By 1945, the Japanese Empire was starving from the inside out. Its troops, its islands, even its cities were running on fumes. The powerful machine that had once stretched across the Pacific now creaked under its own weight, shattered by years of overreach and isolation. The supply lines that once brought rice, fuel, steel, and hope had been severed by American submarines, torpedoes carving invisible walls between Japan and its far-flung outposts. On the island of Luzon, a Japanese soldier named Morimoto wrote in his diary with a piece of charcoal on scrap paper. His handwriting trembled from hunger. He described eating tree bark soaked in water and rice mixed with crushed insect shells. At night, his unit would take turns chewing rubber straps from their gear, pretending it was food, just to trick the brain into silence. That entry ended with 4 words: "We are becoming shadows." This was not isolated. Across the Pacific theater, from the Marianas to the Philippines, the Japanese army was dissolving, not from gunfire, but from absence. Absence of calories, absence of protein, absence of fuel to move, of fabric to clothe, of medicine to heal. They were stranded not just geographically but metabolically. On Iwo Jima, American Marines took a fortified hill after a grueling 3-day push. Among the trenches they found documents, rifles, and journals. But what stood out were the bodies, not fresh, not fallen in combat, but skeletal. Many Japanese soldiers had died before the fighting even began. Malnutrition had drained them of the strength to shoot. Their rifles were loaded, but their hands could no longer lift them. In contrast, the Americans who took that same hill carried packs weighing over 70 pounds, climbed slopes under fire, and still had enough energy to build makeshift kitchens by the third evening. They weren't superheroes. They were well-fed. Each soldier consumed upwards of 4,000 calories per day, including ration packs enhanced with high-energy supplements, dehydrated fruits, compressed biscuits, chocolate bars, coffee, milkshake powder. Some units even received vitamin tablets with their morning meal. It was war by logistics, warfare built not just on strategy, but on biology. The Americans didn't just bring bullets, they brought balance. And it was that balance, between mind, body, and machine, that broke the enemy from within. By April, Japanese High Command was sending coded messages to units across the Pacific that were little more than eulogies in disguise. Hold out as long as possible. Use available resources. Fight to the end. These were not orders. They were admissions. The resources were gone. The ends had already arrived. The empire had begun its long, quiet collapse. Even in Japan itself, civilians were boiling roots and weeds to stretch what little food remained. Government propaganda films showed smiling families harvesting sweet potatoes, but the reality behind the screen was darker. Children fainted at school from hunger. Mothers traded family heirlooms for half-empty sacks of barley. In the countryside, entire villages stopped receiving any shipments at all. And yet, across the ocean, a different reality unfolded. American soldiers were being issued fresh uniforms, new boots, extra toothbrushes. They wrote letters on paper flown in from California. They received care packages from strangers, cookies, photos, comic books, and they drank milkshakes, cold ones, on beaches still lined with shell craters, in jungles still echoing with gunfire. On Saipan, an American logistics officer named Captain Miller documented the arrival of a refrigeration barge. It had been towed behind a naval vessel for nearly 4,000 miles, powered by an onboard diesel generator. It carried one thing: morale food, ice cream mix, canned fruit, condensed milk. The crew called it the Sweet Ship. They unloaded under the cover of night, using minimal light to avoid drawing enemy attention. The next morning, soldiers who had spent weeks fighting hand-to-hand in caves and ravines were handed metal cups filled with real milkshakes. The effect was more than nutritional. It was spiritual. They stood in silence, sipping something cold while the sun rose over what was left of the island. For a few seconds, the war felt far away, and that distance, no matter how brief, gave them strength. On the other side, Japanese survivors of the same battle were digging for snails and boiling strips of their own leather belts. A captured soldier, interviewed months later, broke down crying when asked about the food, not because of what he lacked, but because of what he saw. They had ice. We had nothing. They had food with sugar. We had water and hope. Only hope. That hope was running dry. As the months dragged on, more and more Japanese officers began to realize that their men were not fighting an equal enemy. They were facing an industrial ghost, one that arrived full, fought full, and left with full bellies. Every new American landing brought not just weapons, but an entire ecosystem. Tents, kitchens, sanitation, hydration, even entertainment. To the Japanese, it was alien. To the Americans, it was standard operating procedure. There was no miracle in this, no luck, just design. Every ounce of milkshake powder, every can of peaches, every crate of vitaminized crackers had a role to play, to feed the flesh that fueled the fight. Meanwhile, Japan was feeding its soldiers cardboard and prayer. Even kamikaze pilots, glorified in their final moments, were often sent to their deaths with less than 800 calories in their system. Some wore uniforms too loose to stay buttoned. Others flew without maps because paper had run out. One pilot's final letter was found inside his boot, addressed to a sister he hadn't seen in 4 years. It said, "I am not afraid of death, but I am afraid my stomach will speak before I do. The body always tells the truth, and the truth was clear. The American soldier could endure longer, strike harder, move faster, and recover quicker, not because of training alone, but because of what was inside him: the fuel, the rest, the replenishment, and yes, the milkshake. A war is not just fought with weapons. It is fought with digestion, with blood sugar, with protein, with planning. And when that planning fails, men fall before a single shot is fired. Let us know your reflections in the comments. How did this part of the story reshape your view of World War II? If these deeper truths connect with you, hit that subscribe button and help us bring the hidden side of history into the light. You're part of that mission now. Victory in its final form is not declared with a flag. It is whispered through a pattern of systems that do not break, of routines that continue through chaos, of comfort that endures in places where comfort has no right to exist. By the spring of 1945, the United States had redefined how war was sustained, not just fought, but supported, not just commanded, but carried, on rails, on trucks, in crates, in cups. While many nations saw morale as a side effect of victory, the Americans had treated it as a condition for it, a prerequisite, a formula, and somewhere inside that formula was the milkshake. It had evolved from indulgence to doctrine, no longer a symbol of abundance. Now, a deliberate tactic of replenishment. The milkshake had become an instrument of rhythm. When delivered properly, it became a beat within the march of war, predictable, reassuring, like a metronome cutting through the noise of artillery. The battlefield had always been brutal. No amount of sugar could change that. But what the Americans understood was that amidst the brutality, the human brain needed moments of familiarity to stay functional. And so, they built those moments, one crate at a time. They embedded them into the daily structure of life at war: scheduled coffee breaks, hot meals at 1700 hours, sweet rations every third day. There was nothing random about it. This was not luxury. It was regulation. A war of procedure, a war of maintenance, a war of repetition designed to reduce panic and sharpen clarity. This is what Japan never accounted for. Their philosophy of battle still clung to notions of glory through sacrifice. The idea that deprivation forged strength, that suffering proved character, that a man who had gone without was somehow more prepared for death, and thus more worthy of victory. But war does not reward nobility. It rewards systems. And America's system ran like clockwork, even in the mud. Consider this. During the Battle of Okinawa, while Japanese forces operated with increasingly erratic supply drops, American engineers constructed fully functioning mess halls just weeks into the assault, with refrigeration, with seating arrangements, with inventory checklists and calorie tracking per unit. Behind every spoonful of food, there was data. Behind every milkshake, a calculation. One unit in the Pacific even kept a handwritten morale log, tracking emotional states alongside meal patterns. It showed that soldiers who received consistent comfort food, including milkshakes, chocolate, and sweetened condensed milk, were less likely to report stress, depression, or combat fatigue. The results were reviewed by medics and commanding officers to determine rotation schedules and rest breaks. This was warfare by wellness. And what shocked the enemy wasn't just that it worked. It was how quietly it worked. No victory parade, no announcement, just a slow erosion of resistance. By the time the Japanese command recognized what was happening, they were already inside the spiral, outsupplied, outrested, outrecovered. They were being overtaken by a machine that fed its people like it fed its tanks, with calculated precision and a cold understanding of human limits. The milkshake was just a symbol, but it was a powerful one, because it turned comfort into confidence. It told a soldier that the system was still running, that if they had time to mix chocolate powder into chilled water, then things were under control. No one panics when the milk still gets delivered. And there was something deeper, something unspoken. The milkshake reminded them of who they were before the war, of malt shops and jukeboxes, of first dates, of summer nights. It was nostalgia weaponized, memory as ammunition. It allowed the American soldier to remain connected to his identity, to stay tethered to something real. While the enemy faded into desperation, the GI stayed human. And that, perhaps more than anything, was the real victory. Because war is not just a contest of force, it is a contest of identity, of which side can retain its soul longest. The Japanese soldier, stripped of food, warmth, and choice, became a ghost of the empire that had sent him. But the American, handed a tin cup of sweet cold memory, stayed grounded. He was still part of something, still protected, still replenished, still alive, in every sense of the word. So the milkshake was never just a drink. It was proof that morale could be built, not begged, that comfort could be engineered. That victory was not won through suffering, but through the refusal to let suffering become strategy. Tell us what this meant to you. Did this shift your perspective on how wars are really won? Drop your thoughts below, and if you believe these stories deserve a place in the light, subscribe now. The more we remember, the more we understand. They used to laugh. In the early days, when the first American crates were unloaded onto muddy beaches and jungle clearings, Japanese officers couldn't hide their amusement. Milkshakes, ice cream, chocolate drink powder in the middle of a war zone. It felt absurd. They saw soldiers smiling with tin cups in hand, sipping something cold under the tropical sun, and they mistook it for weakness. They had no idea they were witnessing a storm they could not stop, because what looked like indulgence was actually the engine of something far greater, a war machine that fed its soldiers with both calories and memory. That sustained not just the body, but the identity, a system so vast, so calculated, and so unshakably committed to endurance that even its luxuries were weapons in disguise. And over time, the laughter faded. They stopped laughing when they realized the Americans didn't collapse in the mud. They stopped laughing when they watched their own troops wither while the enemy grew stronger. They stopped laughing when the jungle didn't break the men it was supposed to drown. They stopped laughing when they found milkshake powder on the front lines, still cold. In one recovered field report from a Japanese officer, a single line stood out, written in the final months of the war, when defeat had moved from possibility to inevitability. We believed their comforts made them soft, but it made them unbreakable. By May of 1945, the skies were no longer contested. The Japanese Air Force, once proud and feared, had become a shadow of its former self, not because of superior tactics alone, but because its pilots were flying on empty stomachs and burned-out engines. The American pilots, in contrast, took to the skies nourished, rested, and supported by a logistics empire that never slept. And still, the milkshakes came. Not every day, not everywhere, but just enough. Just often enough to remind the men who fought that they were not forgotten, that the nation that sent them had not surrendered their humanity to the war, that they could still laugh, still taste, still remember who they were, even as the world around them fell into ash and fire. After the war, when former enemies sat down to tell their stories, something strange emerged. Many Japanese veterans, men who had spent years believing they were fighting a crude, soft, inferior enemy, began to speak with something unexpected. Not hatred, not bitterness, but awe, respect. They remembered how the Americans seemed tireless, how they never ran out of food, how they brought entertainment, warm meals, and medicine even to the most remote islands, how they could take a burned-out clearing and turn it into a base camp within days. One former officer said, "They fought with trucks and ships and food and music. I think that is why they won." And another, more quietly, confessed, "I envied their milk, their cold drinks, their ability to rest." It is a detail rarely mentioned in textbooks, rarely shown in films, but it lingers in the memories of those who survived, because it wasn't the tanks that haunted them, or the bombs. It was the realization that the Americans were not just soldiers, they were sustained men, whole men, and in a war that stripped everything away, wholeness was the deadliest weapon of all. So when we look back, it is easy to fixate on the machines, the battles, the explosions frozen in black and white. But somewhere in that story is a quieter truth. A soldier sitting on a crate in the jungle, dirt on his face, bandage on his arm, and in his hand, a cup of milkshake. Cold, sweet, silent, powerful. That moment may not have made it into the history books, but it helped shape the ending written in them. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most unusual and strangely human weapons of World War II. A reminder that sometimes victory does not come with a roar, but with a hum, a hiss, a sip, a breath of comfort in the middle of chaos. If this story moved you, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe these forgotten chapters of history deserve a voice, hit that subscribe button. And don't stop here. Click the next video now appearing on your screen, and continue uncovering the moments that changed everything, not through force, but through precision, care, and quiet power. Because sometimes, the smallest things leave the deepest marks.